4 hours of Jesus' life. We picked up this week after the Passover meal, the Seder meal that Jesus had just had with his disciples. We talked about that last week. And the first verse that we hear today is, after they sang a psalm, they left for the Mount of Olives. Now, interestingly, the very last thing that is done as part of the Passover is a reading of psalms called the Hallel. And that is a specific set of psalms, Psalms 113 through 118. And they are read entirely or recited entirely as one of the closing things that is done. It may have even been sung. That may be the song, the hymn, the song that they sang right before they left. And I'm sure Jesus would have had these words freshly on his mind as he's walking with his disciples over to the Mount of Olives. And I want to read some of those for you. This comes from Psalm 118. These are just some selected verses. Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His steadfast love endures forever. Out of my distress, I called on the Lord. The Lord answered me and set me in a broad place. With the Lord on my side, I do not fear. What can mortals do to me? I was pushed hard so that I was falling, but the Lord helped me. The Lord is my strength and my might. He has become my salvation. I shall not die, but I shall live and recount the deeds of the Lord. The stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. This is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. Those are 6 or 7 verses that came from Psalm 118, the last psalm that they would have read before they left. Those are words that are on Jesus' mind. He knew what was coming, yet he still had to contemplate it. And that's what we hear about in today's story. As Jesus was walking, he also said something to his disciples that was very interesting. He said, "You will all abandon me." Now, earlier that night, he had been abandoned by Judas. He'd already had one disciple already turn his back on him. But now he makes this pronouncement that you will all abandon me. Because at the dinner, they were all like, well, who is it? Who is the one who's going to betray me? Well, now he's coming back and saying, you all going to abandon me. And they were like, no, we won't. No, we won't. Peter says, no, I will not. I will die with you before I abandon you. Jesus says, no, you're wrong there. You will deny me 3 times before the sun rises. They didn't quite see how that would happen. They didn't know the events that were going to unfold. They still couldn't see the full picture of what was going to happen. But Jesus didn't say that like he was angry or mad. It was kind of just like a statement of fact. And I think he meant it to be ultimately a statement of reassurance, because he says, I go before you to Galilee. It's like he's already saying, I know you're going to abandon me, but we are going to be back together. You're going to join me again, and we're going to have great work to do. Don't feel so ashamed that you've abandoned me that you won't come back. We're going to get back together. We're going to get back together in Galilee. It's like he is telling you. Once they got to the Mount of Olives, they came to this place called the Garden of Gethsemane. And it's an interesting little place. I've got some slides I wanted to show you to see if I could, and for those of you in the back row, this is your punishment. You should have sat closer so you can see these a little bit closer. Because when you're up close, you can see them a little bit better. Now, you see there's a kind of like a V of 2 valleys right there. The one that is on the right, that is the Kidron Valley. And that big kind of block that's towards the top of that V, that is the Temple Mount. Right across the Kidron Valley, that is the Mount of Olives. It is not a very far walk. You walk down into that valley, you walk up to the other side. It's probably at most a mile if you were to walk all of the hills and go back up. It is not very far. And this is where Jesus gathered with his disciples a lot. They gathered over there. It was close. And when you're over the temple. And so it was a place where you could rest and you could withdraw from the busyness. The next slide I wanted to show you. Now this is an area, obviously, you can't see the valley as much, but we are looking east. And all of you see the Dome of the Rock there. This is a more modern picture, obviously. But just above that, that is also the Mount of Olives. And you can kind of see that kind of open area at the very top where that is the wilderness just beyond. The top, after you get to the top of the Mount of Olives, it basically starts turning into the desert, the wilderness. And it's not very far. So in less than 2 miles from the temple, you start hitting the wilderness where there is nothing. There's a few little settlements out there now, but back in Jesus' time, there would have been nothing out there. Remember that. I'll come back to that in just a moment. This is how close this proximity of the Garden of Olives is, or the Mount of Olives and the Garden of Gethsemane. The next picture I've got is a picture of an olive tree that is in the Garden of Gethsemane. This tree is very old. There are some folks that believe this is one of the trees that was there when Jesus was there. We really have no idea of knowing, but we do know that it is several hundred years old. It'd probably take 3 or 4 people of us to put our arms together and reach all the way around it. There is a garden that is still there that probably has a dozen trees like this. Most of the others are very small, fairly new planted, but this is a very old garden. And this is where Jesus gathered with his disciples. He gathered in this garden and he came there to pray. He came there and he said, y'all keep watch while I come over here and pray. Then he took Peter, James, and John aside, his closest of all of his friends. And he confided something in them that I don't know about you, I find it a little bit troubling. He said, I am troubled. I'm grieved even unto death. Now, why would Jesus say something like that? Why would he say he's grieved unto death? I mean, I always picture Jesus as being strong and knowing what's going to happen, even when it came time for his own death. And in fact, if you read the Gospel of John, it does come across that way. John never says that Jesus struggled with anything. He just went, and this was his time. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have this notion that Jesus was distressed. And I believe what's happening there is Jesus is struggling with this human side, because we believe Jesus is fully God and fully human. If he doesn't struggle with temptation, then I don't know how you can say you're fully human. Because we all struggle with temptation. Temptation to do the wrong thing, temptation to not do something when we should. Jesus had to have been tempted to flee. And he could have. Remember, just probably a half mile or a mile over the top of the Mount of Olives was the wilderness. People spent years hiding out in the wilderness. He could have been lost, and they would have never found him. He could have run. And it was close by. But he didn't. He stayed, and he prayed. He stayed with his disciples, even though he knew what was coming. In Luke, we even get a further description. It said he was praying and great drops of blood, sweat drops of blood came out. He was anxious beyond anything we could possibly imagine. You're talking about a serious panic attack. How many of you have ever been in a situation where you were almost so nervous about something that you didn't know what to do, whether it was a test you're about to take or whether it was an event you had to do? Maybe it was the first time you had to give a speech in speech class or stand up and do something like this. Maybe it's that time you're in a small group and somebody looks around, okay, I need somebody to close in prayer, and everybody looks down at their feet and goes, please don't ask me, please don't ask me, please don't ask me. Those are nothing compared praying to God, probably remembering some of those words that we heard in Psalm 118. Trying to find some reassurance and knowing that these were the steps that God had laid out for him, that this was Jesus' and he had to walk. Does anybody have any idea why they call this the Garden of Gethsemane, where these olive trees are? Yeah, it is. The next slide. Does anybody know what that is? That is a Gethsemane. It is a press. It is an olive press or a wine press. You put the olives in that little channel. That stone, you would usually have a long piece of wood that goes through there that you could tie a donkey up to. It would just walk in circles and crush those. A lot of them have little spouts where the oil would come out or the grape juice would come out. This is what a Gethsemane is. And so really, we could almost rename the Garden of Gethsemane to the Garden of the Press. The Garden of Pressure. How poetic is that? That is where Jesus is while he's praying. A Gethsemane is for squeezing oil out of olives. It's for squeezing juice out of grapes. And even the life and the blood out of Jesus. Was this what Jesus was praying for? For this cup to be taken from him? I believe that it was. Now, the interesting thing about that prayer of this cup to be taken from you, many of us have probably quoted this or thought about this. It's not my will, Lord, but yours. But if you would like to change your mind, Jesus knew this was his path, but wouldn't have minded if God changed his mind. I think that's another example of humanity and his struggle with humanity. Jesus knew what was coming. But then he comes back and he sees his disciples sleeping. He comes back and he says, "Can't you even stay awake for a little longer? Can't you even stay awake?" Now, if you remember, last week when I was talking about the Passover, I said it started at sundown and it lasted 3, 4, 5 hours. It was probably 11 o'clock, maybe even as late as midnight, before they even left and walked over to the Mount of Olives. So it is in the middle of the night. It is dark. And Jesus says, "Stay awake." And if you also remember, there was part of the meal was, at minimum, those 4 glasses of wine. So put in the middle of the night with 4 glasses of wine, how many of you can stay awake? It's probably quiet. Everybody else is sleeping that's around. And Jesus goes off. Who knows how long he'd actually been gone? But they all fell asleep. But Jesus comes back and he doesn't really fuss at them too much. He kind of states the obvious. He says, the spirit is willing, but the flesh isn't able. It's like he's saying, I know. I knew you were all going to fall asleep. And this falling asleep, I believe, is the foreshadowing of all of their abandonment. It was the first time they abandoned Jesus that night. They didn't keep watching him. They all fell asleep. And then right after that, they heard a crowd coming. And Judas arrived. And Judas was needed because the officials from the temple would not have known where to find Jesus. The next slide right here is a slide of the Mount of Olives. Oh, no, that's a slide of, that's a NASCAR tailgate. And I picture that is what the Mount of Olives looked like on Passover weekend. Work with me here on this one. Passover weekend was a major festival. People came in town from all over to observe the Passover in Jerusalem. some 50 to 150,000 people came in every Passover to celebrate the Passover in Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem was not, it was a big city, but it wasn't like Houston or Dallas. It was a big city, but it wasn't that big. These people needed a place to stay. They'd come in from all over. And so they needed a place to stay. The Mount of Olives was the closest place. It was just across that valley. Everybody's camping out on the Mount of Olives. The next picture I've got is a picture of a larger section. That right there is the Church of All Nations. And that is just probably about a third of the Mount of Olives, that part right in there. And you can see there's lots of space. Put 150,000 people in there. How are they going to know where to go find Jesus? It's not like there's only one campfire out there and they're going to walk up to it. There was a lot of people in town. They were all camped out on this hill. They didn't know where Jesus was going to be. So they needed an insider who knew where Jesus would be. There enters Judas. They came to this location a lot. Judas knew this was the spot they would have come to. Judas could lead them to Jesus. And that place was in the Garden of Gethsemane, which is located to the side of this modern-day church called the Church of All Nations. The Church of All Nations, interestingly, was built on that location because it is believed to have been the place where Jesus wept, or Jesus, not wept, but Jesus prayed and he sweated these drops of blood. But this location is also mentioned in Scripture in the book of Joel, Joel chapter 3. God speaks to the prophet Joel, says, I will gather all the nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat, and I will enter into judgment with them there. The valley of Jehoshaphat is the Old Testament name for the Kidron Valley, this location right here. This is where the final judgment is going to be. God's going to gather all the nations, and this is where the final judgment is going to be. It's interesting that this is the location where Jesus is captured and he is taken away right before he is judged. And that's the reason that church, the Church of All Nations, the place where all nations will be judged, is there. But this is where Jesus is when he is captured. There's a little skirmish. Peter pulls out his sword, cuts off the ear of the high priest's servant. Luke tells us that Jesus healed that servant's ear by touching him. But then they grabbed Jesus and took him away. And where did the disciples go? They scattered. They abandoned him. They left. Just as Jesus said they would. Jesus knew that his closest friends, the 11 people that were left of his closest inner circle, he knew that they would abandon him. Do we think that it's something that we might do as well? Certainly so. Where in our lives can we think of times where we have abandoned Jesus Christ? Where are times where we have not followed the path that Jesus wants to follow? Where are those times that we have prayed to God, please, take this cup from me. Give it to somebody else. Change your mind. Can we negotiate on this? Where are those times where we have denied Christ? Where are those times that we have fallen asleep on God? The reassuring news is that Jesus knows we're going to do this. And yet he is still willing and wants to welcome us with his open arms, just as he did his disciples. There is grace that we sing about. There's grace that is real. Jesus welcomes us all back. And when he does that, and when we follow the path that he calls us to be on, God can do great things. Gracious God, forgive us for abandoning you. Forgive us for not following the path that you have laid out before us. Help us, Lord, to deny ourselves, to deny our own flesh, to deny our own humanity, and to take up the higher cause of your kingdom. Show your light through us as we follow the path you've laid out for us. Give us the courage and the strength to go through life's difficulties, and help us to remember the difficulties Jesus went through on this last night. Difficulties that none of us can possibly imagine what it was like. Give us the courage and the strength